Paul Palms is Principal Consultant with Business Systems Architects, Inc. In Fargo, North Dakota, and Prescott, Wisconsin. He's Chairman of the International Technical Committee 176, Subcommittee 1, which is responsible for the revision of ISO 9000. He's also Chairman of the U.S. TAG to ISO TC 176. Paul, take it away.
Thank you very much. We're here today to talk about what's in your toolbox. To try to see if we can become better auditors by a more effective approach to the whole concept of developing the audit plan and seeing the audit in two distinct parts or phases. And when we talk about tools and toolboxes, it's obvious that you have to take the tools out of the box in order for any of this to be of value. The corollary is that choosing the right tool is perhaps even as important as having the courage at times to open the toolbox and give new tools a try. I know that I have several Phillips screw heads in my past that have been deformed through the use of the wrong tool. I learned by it though, and it became clear to me that some of those lessons in terms of the mechanics of tools are also applicable to the mechanics of auditing. Now, in terms of the auditing process itself, we're kind of fortunate here because Annex SL in the ISO directives, the high-level structure, now essentially unites the approach through clause names and numbers within aerospace and, of course, 9001, the environmental standard, and automotive. All of those now share common structure, which means that especially in the areas which I'm calling Part 1 approaches, all of those issues have to be addressed at some point during the audit, things such as context and leadership and so forth, interested parties. And so this is not just for an ISO 9001 audit that I'm speaking today. It's to any one of a number of different sector-specific applications. The agenda is pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about audit style and approach, a bit about some of those tools that you may have tried once and thought maybe I'll put that away and not try it again. Or maybe these are tools you've never heard of, or you heard of it but didn't know how to approach it. Things such as backward trace, waste analysis, using PDCA as your audit approach. And then the whole concept of closing as partners, that this is an important relationship between the auditor and the auditee, and how to try to create the greatest value for both parties. Now, this comes from the description of this presentation. An effective audit is the product of a 360-degree search that begins with a meaningful audit plan designed as a path of discovery. A meaningful audit plan. Too often, as auditors, when we develop audit plans, we're doing it because we have to, rather than seeing the audit plan as an opportunity to define an audit path that will get the maximum benefit for both the auditor and the auditee. We've got to break this down a little bit. Simply because audit plans communicate what we're going to do. It's utterly transparent. We intend to audit this process or this set of requirements at this time of day with the following people in attendance. This especially is true for setting up an audit for an audit team. The method that we're going to use is oftentimes discussed in an audit plan. I've seen where auditors actually say that we're going to go out and we're going to choose one or two purchase orders to follow through all the requirements of the standard once we've completed the plant tour. I've also seen, and we're going to discuss later, the idea that if you're going to, for example, follow up on prior nonconformance, that you would put that in the audit plan by making note that, there was a previous nonconformance in shipping, so we will verify that the corrective action was effective during that phase of the audit. So transparency, method, we communicate importance oftentimes in an audit plan just simply through duration. If it's time to audit design, for example, if design is coming up during the next surveillance audit, that's a pretty complex subject. And it's clear that these large complex areas are speaking to importance, and that we're going to take our time, and that we're going to do our best to give a thorough examination. And finally, that everybody is accountable to what's in that audit plan, both the auditor and the auditee. And we all know that the publication of an audit plan communicates a bunch of stuff to the auditee, not the least of which what the auditor will probably find, which then, of course, sets off, and I know this from having been a quality director and a quality manager in past lives, that there's any one of a number of internal pre-audit conversations that follow once that audit plan has been published by the auditor. And those conversations, you all know what they're about. It's be sure to say this and not say that. And this is human nature. These things will happen. The third is sometimes you see that your audit plan becomes scheduleized, as I say here. I made up a word, by the auditee. I've seen where I've set the audit plan, and the next thing I know, a week later, I get a spreadsheet back from the management representative or the quality director, whoever, that now has who I'm going to see, where I'm going to see them, and how long it's going to take to get from point A to point B in their large plant. Do I have any dietary restrictions, as they intend to have Subway sandwiches, assortment of Subway's sandwiches each day? And it's kind of like a control thing. When I've seen this, that the auditee is saying, just remember that if this is what you want to do, here are the issues that we have in order to accomplish this. So even with all of that detail that's supplied by the auditee, remember that one of the first things we have to do during the opening meeting is to make clear that this might necessarily be adapted a bit from the time allotted, the expected time allotted. We may run into problems. We may find things that need further inquiry, et cetera. Don't forget to make it clear, especially when you receive a schedulized rendition of your audit plan. Be wary of the potential that there's a lot of control issues going on. The thing of it is, from an auditor or lead auditor's perspective, that the audit plan is too often simply administrative. It must be done because it's expected versus this is something that will really have a profound effect on the audit. That if we really want to be effective auditors, an effective audit plan is really the first step. It's not just something that we have to do. The sub-bullet, that this should not be a nuisance or a last-minute exercise. But I remember very, very, very well that it became such when I was a full-time auditing, and it shouldn't be. It requires a bit more thought and planning to get a great audit plan, because the audit plan is defining the context of the audit and the interested parties, both of which are essentially leading to what the vision is going to be from the auditor's perspective of how that audit is to proceed. That there is thought to the audit plan means there is vision involved. And if we envision in the audit plan what it is we're trying to achieve, we then execute according to that vision. Let's go into this a bit more. If you envision what the audit plan's outcome will be, what is it that you're seeing? It's almost always in two parts. And this is really high level. Part one is planning. It's management issues, management review, management commitment and leadership. It's the risk approach, internal audits, nonconformance. I could go on, right? Let's see if we can get them all. we would have also, documentation, management, records, of course, now all documented information. And you can see I put in red, these are conference room conversations. This is where you can pull up all this information and everybody can see it on the screen. If you have an audit team, it's really good to have them to be part of at least witness to at least part of these discussions, these part one discussions. It gives them grounding for when they go out and actually do some of the part two audit of processes and different techniques involved in part two process audits. But part one is the nuts and bolts stuff. It's oftentimes just a huge amount of stuff that has to be examined before we go into separate process examinations in part two. If we move even deeper into this, part one activities, can be broken down into yet two different approaches. The one is to do all of what you see here as something that is a part of or as a result of the opening meeting and the walkthrough. That we sit down with management, and this is typically how it's done. After the walkthrough, we spend time with senior management and we go through management-related issues. Might even move into risk and risk mitigation approaches. But when it comes to internal audit, nonconformance, corrective action, these are things where typically we say thank you to the management team. We'll see you at the closing meeting. Now we'd like to continue on with our management representative. All of that can be done in a day. This, again, is conference room stuff. But you could take several of these, such as, say, nonconformance, corrective action, certainly how the approach to documentation, and intersperse them throughout part two activities at the best or the most appropriate time. So, for example, if you had two nonconformances in shipping from a prior audit, you could look at the documented outcome, effectiveness statement, or whatever they use in their system, in the conference room as you examine what they did in relation to the prior nonconformance. Or you could go to shipping. This is the other, where you intersperse some of this basic part one stuff. You could go to shipping and in the shipping area approach these two prior nonconformities and ask, how did you manage it? According to the documentation, you did this and this. Was it effective? Let's go over and take a look. There'd be more of a hands-on. And also those who were involved in the fix are not in a conference room. They're right there where the issue was discovered during the last audit. So there oftentimes is greater relevance if you can intersperse some of what has been traditionally part one conference room stuff within the actual audit itself, okay? So what's the best time and what's the most appropriate time to do that has to be determined prior to even coming into the building. In this case, you would put it in the audit plan that nonconformance 1 and 2 will be reviewed during the audit of the shipping department on, Tuesday morning at 9:30. Moving through, we go now to the next part of the description of this presentation, that the opening meeting, plant tour, and examination of context that moves us through scope and leadership sets in motion any one of a number of themes and expectations based on that part one stuff through interview and observation that we then confirm or find issue with later on during process examinations. The deeper we work in the traditional part one examinations of management and context and so forth, the more we hear those themes and then leave the conference room setting, we should be hearing at least the theme and variation elsewhere throughout the plant. Now, this opening meeting is important. It's setting attitudes, or at least witnessing attitudes, and or appreciation of the standard, appreciation of the process. And when we take the plant tour, is it safe? Is it organized? Is there optimal use of space? What are we seeing during the plant tour? Because at the end of the day, that's an impression that the auditee wants to know what your impression was. They want to know what you thought of safety, organization, creative use of space. And the most important part of all of this is whether or not it again affects the audit plan. Because if you saw, for example, that there was a lot of issues when it came to safety, you may have to spend some time, some extra time, delving into that area. The human error issues, for example, might come up. There could be any one of a number of things that grew out of just the plant tour that would be worthy of a further investigation. So this is the time to tell them that it could affect the audit plan. We might spend a little more time in one place or another. Specific Part 1 approaches. This again is the typical stuff that has to be looked at separate from process examinations. Context. We've had a lot of people wonder what context is. It's woven throughout the dialogue within organizations. It could be a SWOT analysis that was done, but in part that SWOT analysis should lead one to think that the outcome does in fact tie well to the mission, the vision, the values of the organization, and wherever warranted, weave is the guide. You can help them see within all these various, statements and policies and outcome of SWOT analysis, perhaps things they had not seen before that are in harmony, one with the other. Do they support what you saw during the plant tour? It's an interesting area to discuss the effectiveness of the whole inquiry into context and what they felt the greatest value was in doing so. Interested parties grow out of context, obviously, the internal and external interested parties. But are they logical? Does the company do a good job of stating who their interested parties are? And does it make sense within the context examination that you just went through? Is there obvious depth of thought? Have they worked hard at trying to determine all of the appropriate interested parties, or was it just a pencil pushing activity? If it was, that's then an opportunity to discuss with them what other interested parties might be at play, and not that you're trying to consult, but you're just asking the question. It could well be that would lead to new insights on the part of the auditee. When it comes to leadership, we have to remember that Clause 5 speaks very specifically in regard to leadership, in regard to keywords such as demonstrated commitment. That if you're going to be auditing leadership, we're looking for something that clearly exhibits leadership and commitment. Something that demonstrates it. If you hear a top leader say, well, we're very committed to the QMS or the EMS or to the aerospace program, that's true, I'm sure, but how have you communicated that within the organization? Do you have a PowerPoint slide that you always put in to your all-employee meetings that speaks directly to one or more of the requirements within Clause 5.1.1. I believe I got that right. All of the 10 or so things that top management should demonstrate in terms of leadership and commitment. Risk-based thinking. Are there primary risks identified? Are they managed accordingly? Do they have a method to probe and identify risk and then create risk mitigation plans? And how are they monitoring risk? All of these are part of that Part 1 inquiry that, on top of this, we have management reviews and so forth. And management reviews can weave well into all of what we've just discussed. It could well be that a lot of the issues such as context, interested parties, and so forth are woven nicely within their management review minutes. approaches everything, right? And the ability to weave one into another shows interrelationship understanding and appreciation for the strength of the program when we are able to see that all of this is leading to, for example, a well-defined quality policy, a vision that is in keeping with that policy, and so forth. Okay, we've done part one. We know how things work there. We know their acronyms. You know that supplier corrective action, they call that a SCAR. We know how things work from a high-level perspective. We know who's involved. We know why. We know the main themes of the organization. It's now time to move from part one thinking into part two, which is essentially requires also envisioning. So, for example, if we're going to do design, if it's time to do design, do we do it first, right after our part one inquiries? Do we go right to design? Typically asking to see what the most recent design that is currently in production might be, because it would be nice to follow that from product concept to design team, through all the various elements of design, through design reviews and validation and verification, and then from there directly into the handoff from design to production, and then right into production. That would be a nice flow from the beginning, if you will, to fruition of the final product. The ultimate would be to finish by moving directly into customer reaction to this new design. That would be the ideal. But you'd start with concept and move all the way through. But you could go backwards too. You could start in production, simply have an interview with the production supervisor, manager, whomever, and say what one or two products are being produced right now that are the result of the most recent design within the organization. And they say, okay, this part number and that part number. And then you go from the final product ready for packaging and move all the way through production and follow that part through all of its various work stages, through the handoff from design, and then move through design backwards through validation, verification, design reviews, design planning, design concept, and so forth. And that would be a backwards trace. Once again, this idea of prior nonconformance is another possibility. You could put in your audit plan again that you're going to examine the two shipping nonconformances from the previous audit during the visit to the shipping department. You certainly could do this as a separate activity during part one. You know, you're going to carve out an hour to go through prior nonconformance, or you instead could weave it into your time spent within the actual process that committed the crime. How's that? But if you're going to do it throughout the audit, note that in the audit plan. In other words, if you're going to be auditing a set of prior nonconformances in the shipping department, note that directly in the audit plan so that they know to prepare for it in that regard. Now, you could then go from shipping to any other process, and as a part of your audit inquiry, say, has there been any recent nonconformance? And then take a look at several of their recent nonconformities, perhaps corrective actions, and you would have accomplished the same thing right at the site, as I said, of the crime, rather than simply having kind of a conference room discussion of nonconformance and corrective action and looking at representative samples on the screen. Here it's far more immediate, and perhaps, at least in my experience, it's immediate and it's far more effective because you can actually see the players, talk to the players who were involved, both in the problem and in the problem's resolution. Backward trace, a little bit more on backward trace. Now, I'm talking about dumpster diving because that's actually how this all happened to me. One of the things I did during one of my audits, with a background in metal stamping as a part of my past, I asked to see how they managed their scrap. And I was led to a large bin that was ready to be picked up by this massive loader and carted away to the company that managed their scrap. But within this scrap bin, I found 20 plus parts that were all beautifully nested together. And obviously rejects, but they were all very nicely fabricated. They weren't very large, maybe 3 inches by 3 inches, but multiple bends and holes and so forth. And I took 3 of those parts back in to the production manager and said, could we trace how it was that I counted 20 some in the scrap bin. Could we trace these back? Where were they just prior to being thrown out? What did it take to get them in the scrap bin? You know, what procedure do you use when you come to the point where you realize you have to scrap these? How did you manage inventory? How did this whole incident get managed? Was it a nonconformance that you created? Was it a corrective action? It's now just started. I mean, it was a wonderful inquiry, beginning at the end of the system and following from conclusion to inception can be an extremely rewarding method, a wonderful tool to use, and especially in a setting such as production. It's a pretty obvious one to use there. But it could be applicable almost anywhere. If you're in purchasing and there was a problem with the wrong parts delivered or delivery issues with a particular supplier, you could also say, let's take this problem and run through it. What did we do as a result of that? Did we make it clear on the original purchase order what we wanted, or did the purchase order actually set in motion what we see as a nonconformance as a result? You know, there are wonderful opportunities to go backwards. How's that? Waste investigation. Every process creates waste. What does the process leader consider as waste? Ask the question. How is it identified? In the case, of course, in production, that's pretty straightforward. But you know, if it's in purchasing, it could perhaps be that their primary waste is the number of expedited shipments. That perhaps with better planning and better control, they could reduce the amount of freight costs if they had a program to do so. So who's responsible for the reduction effort? And how are those efforts proceeding? Waste is an excellent tool to use in Part 2 audit inquiries. Now, it's not something you put on the audit plan, but it is something that you can use at almost any process to start the inquiry by saying, you know, essentially, what within this process is considered waste, and then moving through how they identify it, who's responsible, and whether or not they're actually achieving some desired results. By the way, if you look at that carefully, it's really plan, do, check, act, isn't it? PDCA audits, yes, this was a lead into this slide. No matter where you are in whatever process, you can use PDCA quite handily. And you can see this in some of the figures in ISO 9001. It makes very clear that every process essentially begins with a plan that is then implemented, and then you measure against it to determine whether or not there is something that can be improved. So the plan starts out with what are the risks and what controls did you then put in place. Not that we've actually seen any of these. This is an intellectual discussion. What are the risks and what are the controls that have been put in place? Then actually going to the work center, if you will, what was done with the process. How do you move, and I mean move, how do things move from raw material or whatever the input is to the process through how it's transformed into the output of that process? What is actually done? And can you see risk mitigation that was discussed previously within what you're observing as the work that's being performed. What's measured in the process? Do they have weekly meetings? Do they have monthly reports that the process owner sends to top management? And what's improved as a result? Remember, 4.4.1c is an opportunity for all auditors to go to any process and ask, what do you do to measure process effectiveness? It's very clearly stated in 4.4.1c. They have to have methods and criteria to determine if the process is effective. So anywhere you go, you should be able to ask that question, not just in production. Of course, production has typically all kinds of data to indicate effectiveness from, throughput, machine usage, and so forth. The same should be true in every process, at least say every major process. And of course, as a result of measuring, what was the improvement that came as a result? I mean, if we measure and we find that we have, again, high waste somewhere, we should be setting a program in place in order to reduce it. This is, to me, not only just a favorite pet question, but one that I've always wondered why more auditors don't ask. I'm calling it the golden question because it leads to such gold. Simply looking at someone at some point in your process audit, that's to say a subject audit, and asking them, look, are there any issues or problems that just don't seem to go away? It can lead to any number of some wonderful responses that become great audit trails. Are there recurring issues that slow down the process or prevent folks from responding, quickly? There's all kinds of opportunities for the auditee to give you some really meaningful responses. And it's a very simple question to ask, and most every process has an inhibitor somewhere within it. The most obvious example that I remember was back in, it must have been Windows 7 days, but every time I asked to see a file, it took about a minute for that hourglass, if you all remember the hourglass, to go away. The speed of their computer system was so slow that, at some point I looked and I said, is this something that just seems to be a part of life here, that everybody has to wait to get their files no matter what it is? And yeah, I guess that's true. And that, again, led to some very interesting discussions with the IT people. And coincidentally, on my next visit, things were much improved. But it was, back in those days, we call it an area of concern. That, when you multiply that 1 minute by the number of files trying to be accessed in this organization, that was a huge waste. Okay. An effective audit, again, this is what we said earlier on, is the product of a 360-degree search that begins with a meaningful audit plan designed as a path of discovery. Discovery, not search and destroy. Discovery. It's a good audit is one where both sides prosper. And they're all a compromise. They all are a compromise. And if you're willing to work with the auditee, I believe most auditees are willing to work with you. The nonconformance that's obvious, that you're in the middle of your process audit and you realize that the 25 parts that were found in the dumpster, essentially the operator simply went and got more material, threw those out, and started fabricating again and didn't tell anyone. The obvious nonconformance, that's one where you can look the auditee in the eye and say, we agree, do we not, that this is a nonconformance, and that we should issue that. And you'll almost always get someone say yes. Now, if they give you some grief over it, it could be any one of a number of things, starting with personality conflicts and so forth. But you have a right as an auditor to write that nonconformance. But you can begin the conversation one person to another. Do you not see the logic in this? Rather than, I'm going to write a nonconformance. The the latter posture is that it's a posture, and it doesn't necessarily create the goodwill that would open up conversation within the audit. And you need good conversation in order to get to the bottom of things quite often. So successful audits are a compromise between the auditor and the auditee, but it's not that we compromise what is a requirement within the standard. We work with the auditee. We bring ourselves as best we can to their level to try to help them understand that the nonconformance needs to be written. And I think you typically find that the auditee's reaction is positive. We work with them, and essentially because they're the ones that have to do the work once we leave. And the more that we are there as a partner, the more these nonconformities that we leave behind us, this wake, if you will, that we leave behind us, is something that they feel comfortable in dealing with after the fact, the better the next audit is going to be. And the better their whole response to the process of auditing is. So that's it. That's essentially the point. This makes it such that we leave as partners. We are always just that, auditee and auditor. And to that end, I hope I've helped you in one way or another to try to see from the audit plan through what I'm calling the part 2 potential approaches, where you, again, are working with different approaches to process audits, can be of help. I hope they can be of help. If you need any further guidance, or if you have any questions, please get in touch with me. You can see I've got my email address there, pcpoms@cable1.net. I would be happy to discuss it with you. And I want to thank Exemplar Global for this opportunity to address you today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone, for attending today's presentation. This ends our presentation. Have a good day. Bye.
Okay.